I'm the executive director of Utah Open Lands. I've been with Utah Open Lands for 32 years. I've seen a lot of different development scenarios as we talk about how we plan for our communities. And I think that coming back to the way that this started, the bottom line is, if you win, it's awesome. But if you lose the ability to produce local food that you send back on refrigerated trucks for food that we bring into the state, our food costs go up at least 10%. If you lose clean air to breathe, if you lose clean water, and if you lose some of the recreational amenities that bring people to the community in the first place, there are consequences. And I think that's one of the reasons that we talk so much about making sure that the planning we do is really at the end of the day mindful. And I think that there were a couple of things that were brought up that I'd kind of like to highlight before I start into the main presentation. One of the things I think is really interesting about that whole idea of, are we tired of winning? Believe it or not, 80% of the folks that started Utah Open Lands were real estate agents and developers, because they recognized that if we lost the very reason that people were coming and enjoying the community, moving into the community, then indeed we will have killed the goose that laid the golden egg. And usually I ask this question, but I'll just give you the answer anyway. For the past 32 years, at least that I've been working in the state of Utah, the top two reasons that people come to the state of Utah to visit, they move here or they stay here, are its scenic beauty and recreational opportunity. And you better believe that those farm fields are part of that scenic beauty. We certainly saw during COVID that if you can work remotely, you can live wherever you want to a certain extent. And I think that did definitely drive a lot of even market values in various different communities. And I think the final thing that I would say is that at the end of the day, one of the reasons that protecting values like open space, agricultural farm fields, recreational opportunities, and really looking at some of these tools, whether it's a TDR or a cluster or a density bonus situation or a conservation easement, which I'm going to talk about, is because actually open space preservation makes economic sense. In 2008, we saw that communities that had open space retained their market value when other communities did not. During COVID, Utah's economy grew by 3%, where a lot of other communities' economies didn't, because you could go outside and stay 6 feet apart. And then, of course, there's a statistic that the Utah State University has come out with, and we saw it actually when we were working on the open space bond in Wasatch County. And that is, for every dollar in residential development tax revenue, it actually costs a community between $1.19 and $1.65. So yes, we want to recognize that developers are there. They're going to look at the profits they can make. But as a community, we take on the costs of infrastructure. We take on the costs of the police and the sewer and the maintenance that Tim was talking about once that infrastructure has been put in place. Conversely, for every dollar in revenue that's generated, even off of agricultural greenbelt properties, it only costs a community about 65 cents. And that's even without counting the ancillary benefits that you get from protecting open space and a place that people want to come and enjoy and visit. And the reason for that, obviously, is you're not out there calling the police to corral the cows, right? There's a lot less services that are needed for that agricultural land and for those open spaces. So when I talk about a land trust, for some, I'm the anti-hero, and for some, I'm the hero. So it'll depend on you as to which I am. But we've talked a lot about, and we talk a lot about in the state of Utah, but even throughout the nation, the idea of private property rights. And really, most of our planning departments, most of the work that we do in communities is to allow landowners to exercise their private property right to develop their land. What a land trust does is we help landowners who want to exercise their private property right to preserve their land. And for doing so, there are all sorts of tax benefits that can be accrued. And there's also even the potential of purchasing part or all of the value of the conservation easement. And I'll get into how that works. But I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that aside from a land trust being a 501c3 nonprofit public charity, we also are an entity that is eligible to hold conservation easements under 170H of the federal tax code. And in order for us to be eligible, there are a number of things that we have to meet that are actually come from that code. And it goes to the question that the gentleman asked with respect to the potential cost of maintaining the conservation easement. And I want to talk about two different costs there. One being that we have to have the resources and the commitment to defend the conservation terms. And in order to do that, land trusts always look to have a stewardship fund. And that can vary based on what it is that you're going to have to do in terms of enforcing that conservation easement. Everything from how many reserved rights are there to what are the adjacent landowners going to do that are going to create third-party violations. And I will get into that later. But in addressing that specific question, there's another part of it that isn't just the costs that come from doing the conservation easement, holding the conservation easement into perpetuity, but it also is a cost that gets back to something that I think people talked about with respect to farmers. One of the things that we don't often recognize is what an amazing steward our farmers and ranchers are of our landscapes. They maintain those properties, and it is not a cost to the community. But when you have a sending or a receiving zone, and especially the sending areas, and you've placed a conservation easement on it, and if there are trails for the community, there is long-term costs associated with maintaining those trails, spraying for noxious weeds, all of those sorts of things. So where the landowner, if they continue to own the land, because essentially they continue to do what they want to on the property, the maintenance of the land is borne by the landowner, but there's still a stewardship cost associated with basically the administration of the conservation easement by the land trust. But I would like to say that the other element of land trust before we advance to the next slide is that aside from defending these conservation easements, and I can tell you some great war stories, we also become a steward of the community land and the community resources that are a part of that landscape. And I think what's been brought up today, but I will say it a different way. Oftentimes when we look at how we grow our communities, we think first and foremost about where the roads are going to go, what traffic congestion is going to look like. Maybe we even think about where our commercial centers are going to be. But I would challenge folks, if they really want to preserve the quality of life that they appreciate here in the state of Utah and in their communities, that they really think about what it is that they want to save and how they're really going to be able to accomplish that. And I'll tell you a story about the Kohler Dairy in a moment, and that will help illustrate a little bit about really thinking about what it is you want to save and what exactly is it going to take, because it's not going to just be a conservation easement or a certain amount of money or even just a TDR. It's really a commitment to that value and that resource that sets your community apart. Because the last thing that we really did learn about COVID, and we've seen it repeated over and over and over again, is that they don't want to move to any town USA. They want to move to a place that has resonance. They want to move to a community that calls to them. And as the public affairs director for Park City used to say, nobody wants to leave the suburbs of the LA basin to come and recreate in the suburbs of the mountains. And so that was part of their ideal in terms of what they wanted to protect in designing the sustainability of the economy of their community. So let's go to the next slide. So I think it's important to just get a sense of conservation easements and what they are. And part of it is that a conservation easement is basically an interest in property. And basically until 1985, here in the state of Utah, until we got the conservation easement enabling legislation, we didn't really have the ability to do conservation easements in the same way that it's intended under 170H of the code. And in order to do a conservation easement that you can get a tax deduction for, or that foundations are going to participate in, or that you can do a bargain sale, or that some of these federal programs, which I'm going to talk about later, to get those involved, you have to make sure that you're meeting both the 170H requirements and also working through the enabling legislation from the conservation easement statute. But I think one of the things that you all are probably thinking about, and we know from all sorts of time spent on the land, is that without funding, it becomes increasingly hard to protect lands through a conservation easement, or just to protect lands in general. And a lot of that is because the tax incentive that you can get from that conservation easement, which again is just an interest in the property. We don't own all of the property, and I'll help explain that in a minute. But what was really fortunate for us is in 1999, the legislature started the Utah Critical Lands Task Force, which then in 2000 became the Leroy McAllister Critical Lands Fund. Right now, there's a bill going through the legislature. I believe Representative Casey Snyder has been working on it. And it's really changing the title to kind of a working lands critical fund, so that monies that could be put in there could be spent towards the protection of agricultural and working landscapes. That fund has not been funded in the past couple of years to any substantial amount of money. And that makes it really hard for us to take advantage of some of these federal programs and even of private fundraising when we want to go ahead and protect a piece of property under a conservation easement. So actually, open space bonds that are run by various different communities are one of the ways that we can help to leverage additional funds. So one of the first community open space bonds took place in Park City, and that was in 2000. But there have been open space bonds throughout various different communities. And in fact, many of you are aware that Cache County recently passed an open space bond. I will tell you the good news about that is not only does it provide a vehicle for landowners who want to exercise their private property right to preserve their land while retaining their land, and maybe, as John pointed out, the idea of being able to have some of that retirement fund actually put into cash. One of the other things about these open space bonds that we've seen over and over again is that actually they can be leveraged to a great extent. In some instances, every dollar of bond money from your community can be leveraged 2 to 3 to even 10 times over, stretching those tax dollars and stretching those bond dollars to be able to help more landowners who are interested in protecting their landscapes. And let's go to the next slide as we talk about the fact that the community open space bonds really do create this leveraging for placing a conservation easement on the property. So when you hear about conservation easements, you might hear the term like, oh, well, I did an agricultural easement, or I did a scenic easement, or I did a natural wildlife habitat easement. Basically, those are the conservation purposes that are established both under Utah code and under the federal code that really help us place a conservation easement. And we are basically protecting those conservation purposes by drafting a document that wraps a big bow around the development rights and enables Utah Open Lands to enforce against development on the property in order to preserve the conservation resources like agriculture or forest lands, or what we call clearly delineated government policies, wildlife habitat, and recreation and education values, as well as places that are either under the Register of Historic Places, or, for example, on the East Coast, they've even used it to protect battlefields. Now, I want to make one thing clear. First and foremost, as a landowner, if you wanted to do a conservation easement, you don't have to qualify for all of the conservation purposes. You just have to qualify for one. So you don't have to open your land up to public recreation, for example. You can, but you may just qualify under the scenic value. In other words, looking across your agricultural farm field is something that is a beauty to behold. And that is as recognized as a conservation purpose. In addition to that, and this is where there's a great nexus between the community open space bonds and open space funding and the different federal and private funds that are available out there. So some of you may be familiar with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. There are a number of programs like the Farmland Protection Program, the Wetland Protection Program. Even down in the Salt Lake Valley around Camp Williams, there's the Army Compatible Use Buffer area. All of those are considered these clearly delineated government conservation policies because they're conserving land as open space for a clearly delineated government policy. And you strengthen that when you add an open space bond, because you're saying we're going to put money towards this particular piece of property, and we feel that this is valuable enough for us to expend resources as a community. But what can happen is you can actually purchase the value of the conservation easement through both the bond funds and through basically these federal programs. So let's just talk a little bit about how that works, for example, with the NRCS ALE, the ASEP program, basically. It's their agricultural conservation easement program or their agricultural land easement program. And basically, coming back to that concept of the conservation easement and the purchase of the conservation easement, what basically these programs will do is they'll provide up to, in some instances, 75% of the value of the conservation easement. Sometimes it's only 50% of the value of the conservation easement. But then in that particular instance, the community can come in with 25% of the value of the conservation easement. And because of the tax incentives, which are available through the code, through the federal government, oftentimes landowners are asked to bring in another 25%, not in cash, but in actual land value. And the thing that can be really valuable about that is basically if you're a qualifying agricultural landowner, the conservation easement tax deduction incentive for you is 100% of your adjusted gross income against the value of the gift for up to 16 years, or when that gift is used up. If you're not a qualifying farmer or rancher, you can receive up to 50% of your adjusted gross income against the value of the gift as a tax deduction for the 16 years. And what I like to tell landowners is, one, private foundations really like to see that landowners have skin in the game when it comes to putting money into purchasing a conservation easement. So they like to see what we call bargain sale conservation easements. But then the other part of it that I think is really valuable is if I'm going to engage in a fundraising campaign, it lessens the amount of money that basically the landowner is going to receive and might have to just turn around and pay in taxes. And I'd rather keep the money in the community. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we work with landowners and also how you get to this valuation nugget of the conservation easement, because I think that's important. Oh, I think it may have gone past one. So with conservation easements, I'm going to touch on some of the questions, and I want to talk a little bit about the Kohler Dairy because I think it'll help you understand how we start looking at conservation easements in various different situations. So working with the landowner is probably the traditional role that a conservation easement usually has, or a land trust usually has in doing a conservation easement. And if you think about the value of your land as being the full fair market value is like a whole pie. Well, if Utah Open Lands comes in and takes several slices of that pie that are the development value, we're not taking the whole pie. So we're not going to pay you the full fair market value. We're just going to pay you the value of those slices that we've taken. You may reserve certain slices. You might even reserve a slice that allows you to build another home on your property, for example. But every slice that you reserve takes away from the slices that we're actually purchasing. And in fact, one of the things that we often have to look at when we're doing conservation easements and we're looking at these valuations is that one slice of that really good pie that is left, that has the development right left on it, actually increases in value by the mere fact that we have purchased those other development values. Oftentimes people talk about it in terms of purchasing the development rights. I don't always like to talk about that concept because there's a lot more nuance to it. And the other issue is that we can't participate, nor can you get funding from any of these federal programs that I mentioned, unless you get a qualified conservation easement appraisal. And that is not the same as a fair market value appraisal, because basically what you're doing is you're looking at the fair market value of the property before you have put any encumbrances or restrictions. And then you're looking at the fair market value of the property once you've put all those restrictions on it. And it's the difference between those two values that become the value of the conservation easement. As I mentioned, you can receive a tax deduction. That's the generous deduction that's available through the federal tax system. There are some states, not Utah, but there are some states where you can actually also get a tax credit from your state income. But in addition to that, by being able to use the conservation easement appraisal and go and apply for some of these different federal programs, we actually have a value that we're looking at that before you go into the process, basically, you know what you're going to end up with at the end of the day. And, you know, even though I know for a lot of landowners, their land is their kind of retirement, I think that the thing that we've looked at with landowner after landowner is so many of them will say, even if we had all of this money, we would want to live in this place that is basically the landscape that we're currently on. And so this gives a way for a landowner to continue to be on the land. It saves the community money in terms of maintenance. But then in addition to that, it also is a way, I think, to provide a little bit of that retirement value back. Now, it is in perpetuity in order to qualify. So that means it has to be done forever. There can't be any term limited easements. And yes, you are making a decision about the future of this landscape. But when we look at what we've lost around the state of Utah, and I grew up in Utah County, and the orchards that I used to ride my horse through are no longer there. And when you look at the loss of those landscapes, I think what we really need to look at again in our communities is what is the legacy that we want to leave for the next generation. So beyond working with landowners, Utah Open Lands oftentimes will work with various different communities, whether it's working to help them with their bond process and when they go forward and doing the conservation easement. We also work with HOAs. So oftentimes a developer will come in, maybe able to do the cluster incentive or that bonus density to create open space over here. Well, what guarantees that that open space is going to stay there forever? I can tell you there are a couple of court cases where 10 years later, another developer comes in and wants to develop the open space that was used to get the original bonus densities. And if there's nothing on that property restricting it, oftentimes it's hard to be able to change that. In fact, I know of one community where essentially the homeowners association failed to pay property taxes, and the open space ended up being sold at a sheriff's sale. And it was purchased by a developer who then came in and is now wanting to develop the property. So oftentimes we'll work with HOAs to place a conservation easement on the property, or even with developers. I will tell you that oftentimes that can be a real struggle from a stewardship perspective, because people don't always treat the open space with the same kind of respect that they would treat their backyard. Sometimes they create social trails, really kind of privatizing the open space if it's used for community. So there are a lot of headaches involved in that, but there are also some really great success stories of working with HOAs. And then there are successive lot owners that end up being grantors. or successive landowners. And one thing that's been tough, and this is what we talk about with landowners, is really the function that Utah Open Lands oftentimes serves in working with various different landowners, is one of the reasons we really try to make a tight conservation easement is we're not worried about that first landowner. We're worried about the eventuality of that landowner going away. And if it gets sold to somebody who wants to try and break the conservation easement, or somebody who isn't as passionate about the landscape, that's where we can find some stewardship issues. I touched on the open space maintenance issue, so let's go to the next slide. So that brings us, as we talk about these different entities that might end up with the eventual ownership of these open spaces that we create, we come to TDRs and conservation easements. And I think one of the questions is, why would a land trust not accept land that is created by a TDR? And one of the reasons that we might not accept land that under a conservation easement that's been created by a TDR is because it doesn't really pass the conservation purposes test. And if we hold a conservation easement on a piece of property that we really can't defend long-term because it doesn't pass the conservation purpose test, then we're going to have a problem. And so that's one of the reasons that land trusts are not interested in doing it. Another could be sort of a headache from some of the stewardship responsibilities. But again, coming back to what a lot of people have said in this session today already, one of the things that's really, really key is really focusing on what it is you want to save. And what is the sustainability? What is that going to mean to your economy? What is that going to mean to your community long term? Because if it is really valuable and it's a really treasured landscape and value that you have, chances are a land trust would be willing to hold a conservation easement on it. So again, that's where oftentimes, obviously, with TDRs and land trusts, we can participate with a community as they work through this process. But I want to make one thing very, very clear. You don't get a second bite at the apple. You don't get to double dip. When you've done that TDR transfer, you received value by sending it someplace else. And so you can't get a tax deduction. You can't then sell the conservation easement in a bargain sale situation. There are other ways to protect land that has been basically protected through TDR. There are various different deed restrictions. I actually live in a community here where there is a restrictive covenant on the trails. And because each one of the property owners has a portion of the trail on their property, they are considered anchor parcels, and they have the right to enforce the restrictive covenants. And actually, we just did that and we're successful. It is tough. And it is something that you really want to think about if you really want to ensure that basically the value that you as a community have given to a developer or a landowner in giving them this additional density in the receiving area, that you really have found a good mechanism to protect that sending area and the value that, led you down to the TDR place in the first place. And so I think the question comes down to, can TDRs create long-term community benefit without a deed restriction? And I would caution that, because I think that without a deed restriction, 10, 20 years, I can tell you after 32 years of doing it, enforcing these conservation easements is incredibly tough. I can't imagine what it would be like to have a piece of property that was done through a process and is supposed to be protected, but it doesn't have a conservation easement on it. It doesn't have any sort of deed restriction. In fact, I have watched land that was legislatively protected 10 years later be overturned so that it could be developed. I even have witnessed in a county that will remain nameless, actually trading out land for development that they purchased with open space bond funds because it didn't have a conservation easement on it. So you really want to think through those tools and techniques. And oftentimes, I think has been said before by other speakers, it's actually having a toolbox. You might need a wrench, you might need a hammer, you might need a screwdriver, but you ought to think about the fact that not one tool is going to get the job completely done. Next slide. So, why a land trust? And I think that one of the reasons that I would say why a land trust is not only are we ensuring the community promise, because this is all we do. We don't have to worry about being beholden to anything other than the promise we made in protecting that landscape. And we're a third party to oversee these properties. But I think there's another element, and for that, I'll just touch on the story of the Kohler family up in the Midway area. The Midway community and also Wasatch County both independently passed open space bonds. And they knew desperately that they wanted to protect the scenic character coming into their community. But one of the things that I think was really tough is this element that most of the land they wanted to see protected was agricultural land. And you can't guarantee that the next generation is going to want to move a bunch of hand lines. You can't guarantee that the hard, long hours, especially in a dairy, is going to be there for the next generation. But what we found was even more critical, because the Kohlers were very committed to seeing their land protected, and the next generation, and even the next generation, was, is there an agricultural economy to sustain having agricultural landscapes protected in the community? And so when we talk about size, which I know somebody mentioned before, how small is too small to be able to protect an agricultural landscape? I would really encourage you, and this is one of the things that land trusts do, is they really think through our promises forever. So I want to make sure that there is an agricultural economy to sustain this. And one of the things we talked about with the community is that by preserving the Kohler dairy, we were actually creating what I like to call the anchor tenant, right? When you think about a strip mall, the anchor tenant is what you go after in order to make sure that the strip mall is going to pencil out. Because if you have the Wendy's or the whatever people like to go shop at, I don't know, the Macy's, whatever, you are going to be ensuring that the other businesses that come along into that strip mall have a feeder. They have businesses that are coming in. Well, similarly, by knowing that we had a solid agricultural operation that had its own cheese shop, and that was a tourist destination in and of itself, you were always going to have somebody with the big machineries and tools needed to hay fields and plow fields and all of those sorts of things to be able to, in some instances, lease agricultural land. So in fact, there was a landowner that we worked with. They ended up donating some land to the city. A big portion of that land is agricultural hay and grazing property. And the Kohlers are looking at a potential lease on that property. Now, obviously, the city goes through an RFP process and, make sure that they're not picking favorites. But the point is, we know from the outset that we have a solid agricultural business that we can add to. And that's what I would encourage with folks when they're looking at protecting agriculture in their community. Do you have a nucleus or a nexus? And in fact, that's why a lot of people look at these agricultural protection areas that are afforded through the Utah Code as a gateway to figuring out what agricultural areas they want to eventually place under a conservation easement, because those agricultural protection areas set aside a certain amount of acreage with committed landowners. So it doesn't have to be just one landowner. And you start to see whether or not, okay, this is a consolidated group of farmers that if we can keep them farming, we've got a good anchor tenant, if you will, in our community for agricultural land. The other element is obviously we think through, well, what happens if the agriculture can't continue to sustain itself? We hope that doesn't happen, because again, we all need to eat. So we think there will always be farmers. There will have to always be farmers. But in addition to that, just because we lose some of the agricultural use and utility of that land for a little while doesn't necessarily mean that the other conservation values have gone away. And in fact, we protected one of the first agricultural properties down in the Draper area. That landowner passed away, and for about 10 years, there wasn't a lot of agricultural activity. There's a few leases now and again, Well, today it is the home to a number of different community supported agricultural ventures, from community gardens to the International Rescue Committee is farming on there. And we've had organic farmers, we've had small farmers, we've had potato farmers, we've had a bunch of folks that basically, because they can do truck gardening from there, because they can take it to farmers markets, and because, quite frankly, it is a delight for the community, it is still being farmed. So we think that there are still conservation values on these properties, even if they don't continue to have the agricultural use and utility. The conservation easement's role is really the permanent protection in these landscapes. And I can tell you that we have fought everything from condemnation to third-party violations, and we've done exceedingly well. We've won every single time. The next slide, which I hope and believe is my last one, so I can keep us on time here. I think the main thing that it's important to look at, and this is as important for a landowner as it is for an HOA, as it is for, a city. One of the reasons that it's valuable to work with an organization like a land trust and place a conservation easement on the property is our conservation easement defense, because we defend against violations by third parties. And you can see right here is a violation by a third party on a piece of property that is owned by a city that we have a conservation easement on. And we actually are forcing them to cure the violation. And there's also $250,000 in stewardship restitution that's going to happen as part of the restoration of this property. And that's something that we as a third party are able to help our cities and our communities with. We defend against swaps. When a landowner places their land under a conservation easement, they're doing so because they love their land, and we're making a promise to them that it will always be protected. So we defend against that land somehow being swapped out. We defend against people coming in and wanting to amend the conservation easement and open it up to development. There's several reasons for that. First and foremost, once we do a conservation easement, it becomes a public trust. And once it becomes a public trust, if you open it up for development, you're privately benefiting somebody. So that's kind of a no-no there. But obviously the intention of the conservation easement was to preserve the property from development, not allow for an amendment to develop it. And then finally, we defend against using the conservation easement or amendments or anything like that to cure violations. We make sure that those violations are cured by the offending parties. And we've had great success in doing that as well. In fact, as a land trust, we have conservation easement defense insurance that we carry. And I think that's the last slide, but let's go to the next one just for fun. Okay, it's not. So the bottom line, I think, comes down to, what do you love? What do you want to save? That's our tagline, protecting the lands we love. You can see Bear Lake. That's a piece of property that we worked with the landowners on the shores of Bear Lake. We're working with them right now on additional preservation. But it's important to understand that part of why we are winning is because we saw a 300% increase in the use of our open spaces during the pandemic. And that has not changed. And when you think of something as wonderful and beautiful as the pristine Caribbean blue of Bear Lake, you know that impaired water quality will destroy that. If you look at something like Bonanza Flat, which is up at the top of Big Cottonwood Canyon, we are seeing an increase in people coming out, even just to drive through and take pictures of the incredible fall colors. And as painful as it is sometimes in our communities when the tourists invade, the marketable economic bump that, for example, Park City and Midway City saw from people just driving to see the fall colors on this protected landscape was huge. And it really helped, especially during a time when people weren't going to restaurants. So there are multiple benefits that we can get from protecting open spaces in our communities. But I think it's really, really important that we understand what we want to save, how we want to save it, the best technique for saving it, and then understanding what the long-term trajectory of that landscape and those conservation values are going to be, so we truly can protect these places that we love. And that'll do it for me.
Hey, one quick question.
Will that work?
Okay.
Just quickly, Wendy, I'm just wondering how many properties, how many conservation easements is Utah Open Lands administering right now?
So we have 64,000 acres protected, and that's 100 different conservation easements. Maybe 102 now.
That's terrific. And thank you, Wendy. We've reached our time. There were a couple little other points we want to make, but they're in the handout, and you're going to get those electronically also.
There are copies here.
Yep.
And it's available online.
Online at?
UtahLandUse.org.
There we go. Really appreciate you all being here, and we're going to be around for questions for a little bit. Online, if you have some more chat questions, we'll make a note of those and try and answer them tomorrow. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you, and thank you online. You can. Good work, great panel.